On Radio 97, we're talking law with our resident lawyer, Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay. She's with us each and every Thursday morning. She brings her legal expertise and provides general advice on the latest of hot topics. We've got another couple of hot topics lined up for you. She has experience that spans more than 25 years in the area of property and commercial law. She also prepares wills as part of estate planning and litigation. With us once again. Hi, Despina.
Good morning, Wayne. Good morning, Brooke.
Good morning, Desi. Welcome back to the show. And first up on the radar this morning, we're going to go through the phrase, my contract is unconditional, because it seems like a few people are coming to you and not knowing exactly what unconditional contract is.
Well, that's right. And I think it's important to talk about it because we want to understand what it means before your contract actually goes unconditional. So there's no point going unconditional unless you know the full meaning of what that phrase is when you're under contract. And it does have particular consequences. So I thought we want to talk about that today because invariably it comes up quite a lot when people are under contract. And we, despite how many times a person may have already bought or sold property in the past with us, or particularly for new clients, we always explain to them before we go unconditional what that means for them so they completely understand the decision they're about to make, which is really critical. So what does unconditional mean? So to me, that means, and for everybody else out there, there is no turning back, right?
Dun, dun, dun.
Exactly. You are on the highway to settlement, okay? So there is no reverse and going back. We are moving forward. So that in reality, it means that there are no more conditions to be satisfied. And why is that important? Because when you're under contract, you typically have conditions. Those conditions typically will allow you as a buyer or sometimes a seller to get out of a contract if you're not happy with those conditions. So it makes sense that, okay, we need to understand what those conditions are, and then for you to make a decision to say, hey, I've satisfied all these conditions. I'm really happy. I want to go unconditional, which means all of these conditions can now be ticked off and you can tell everybody we are satisfied and we're moving towards the next stage, which is we're going towards settlement. So it's important to understand that within the context of a few things we're going to talk about today that typically come up. Because as I said, once you go unconditional, there is no reverse. You can't go backwards. You've got to keep going forward and you've got to commit yourself, and you do commit yourself to settle when you say you're unconditional. Really, really critical.
Is there a particular point that you would generally go unconditional, like a certain period of time before this would happen? Or does it vary?
It does vary. Each contract is different. So you'll have your conditions set up and you'll have a time frame for those conditions to be satisfied. So if you do and you are satisfied with those conditions and you give the big green tick, then at that particular time you're unconditional. And then you proceed to the settlement date, whatever that time frame is. But each contract has different timing, and those conditions are set up from the beginning, which then brings the point again as to why it's always important for us to check that contract beforehand to make sure all the timing lines up for you as you play it out in your mind, which might be different to how it is in the contract. Yeah. So few things that come up typically in your contract are your finance, your pest and building condition. Okay, and when that balance deposit is payable. And the other condition that's coming up a lot in this market is a subject to sale. So people have to sell to buy, and it makes sense. And we look at those contracts almost on a daily basis where people are needing a condition in the contract to say, look, this contract is subject to this property of mine settling first, so I can get the money from that sale and I can put it towards the purchase of this one. And if that one never settles, I don't have to buy this property. Yep. So that's really critical. So let's talk about some examples. Okay, with finance. So before you go unconditional, right, under a finance clause, you want to actually make sure your finance approval is an unconditional approval. It sort of makes sense and it's logical to say, but often what happens is the bank will issue a preliminary approval or a conditional approval and it's subject to other things being done. Sometimes there are subject to things that you have to do to complete, like you haven't yet submitted things to the bank for approval as part of your application or whatever it is. So with finance, very important that you get the written unconditional approval to make sure you're happy with it. Then you can give the big green tick for finance and say, yep, I'm unconditional with finance. Pest and building is a really interesting one. So often what we find is the buyer will go get a pest and building inspection done, have the report, read it, and usually there are things, or often a couple of things they're not happy with, right? So maybe there's a broken tile, maybe there's a latch on a fence that doesn't work, or something else that needs fixing. So then we have to write to the seller solicitors and say, okay, we want these items fixed, and then we'll go unconditional. Okay, so if you don't ask for those things and we don't get that agreement and you go unconditional, you can't then say afterwards, well, I want those items fixed. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? So that's why when we talk about unconditional, there are no more conditions to get satisfied. There is nothing else to be done. But in saying that, with your pest and building, what we often do is say, look, our client, the buyer will go unconditional if you promise to do certain things by the settlement date, like fix that broken tile, fix that latch on a fence, or whatever it is, and they agree in writing. So those things have to be done. And then, yes, you can go unconditional, but it's almost saying we're going unconditional, but on the condition you fix all these things. Yeah. So that's not to confuse people, but that's just to understand how that works. So if you want something fixed or repaired, you've got to ask for it before you say, I'm unconditional. Yeah. So that's really important. And the other interesting one is balance deposit. So typically you'll get a contract that says, look, the buyer doesn't have to pay the balance of a deposit until the contract, again, is unconditional. So it's important to understand when that happens, because you want to make sure you've got that balance deposit ready to pay. You actually have that money available, and then to pay it on the due date. Yeah. And the other thing with that is when you have a contract subject to sale, right? The interesting part is, and agents often muck this up, I have to say, is that your contract is never unconditional at any stage until settlement. You'll never have an unconditional contract when it's subject to your sale, because the subject to sale means it's subject to that sale settling. And then when that settles, you settle on your purchase. So you can never be unconditional. And if you've got a contract that says you pay your balance deposit on unconditional and it's got a subject to sale, you really never have to pay your balance deposit. Yeah.
Sneaky little loophole.
Sneaky little loophole. I mean, agents should be aware of this, but they invariably forget about that and just put in the blanket deposit is paid, balance deposit is paid when the contract's unconditional. So again, it's understanding, well, what does that mean in the context of this particular contract?
It sounds like you have to go through, this step and then this step and then this step. It's almost like you need a checklist. I mean, is that something that that you might even give your clients, or at least say to your client, okay, well, you need to tick all of these off, and then we can move on to the next step?
We give our clients so much information. We have our own checklists, which are in abundance, and we have to do that because otherwise you can't manage your files, and particularly conveyancing. There are so many intricacies and steps that you've got to attend to from the beginning to the end, which is why I say it's not simple. It's not something that anyone can do because there's so many things to be aware of, and to put your client on alert, on notice about, okay, your conditions coming up, what does that mean for you? These are the decisions that you can make. These are the options that you have available. What does unconditional mean? There are so many things that have to be done and understood by a buyer, because we go back to the phrase, what does unconditional mean? It means that you are 100% committed to settling. And if you don't, you're in breach. And if you're in breach, that's a big, big no-no, that you don't want to be in a position to say that you're in breach, because you could lose monies you've already paid. You could be sued by the seller. You could be taken to court for damages and all sorts of nasty things. So you don't want to be in that position. So it's always critical to understand what unconditional means. And that really means that everything is satisfied. I'm very happy and I'm moving forward. I'm going on that highway. I'm going towards the settlement destination.
Love it. Thank you so much for your advice, Despina. Coming up next, local laws are changing for pet owners on the Gold Coast as of the 25th of August. So soon. Despina has the details coming up in just a moment.